It gives me great pleasure to serve as the moderator, and thank you so much to our the president of the UNA USA New York State Southern Division, Ginger Stillman, and Patrick for welcoming everybody this morning, and thank you so much for being here today. The topic of this panel is global economy, education, and youth. And why do you think we are really concerned about the youth? Because the youth is the future of tomorrow. As the mother of a youthful daughter, and I have some of my students sitting in the audience, and it's so nice to see so many young people here because you learn so much from coming here, which you don't learn in a classroom. Believe me, this is one of the portals of education, and it's so nice and fulfilling for all of us here. I take the liberty of speaking on behalf of my three esteemed panelists, myself and Ginger, that it's great. Brooke, we excluded you because you're one of them, but we love you and you're sitting right here. It's so great to have you here. And according to the 2012 World Population Data sheet, there are over 1.2 billion people, yes, 1.2 billion people between the ages of 15 and 24 who are technically considered youth. And that nearly accounts for 17% of the population. Unfortunately, almost 40% of the world's youth are unemployed. That means they have jobs they're not happy about, and I'm just going to steal this from Kevin's line saying they don't have decent work. So, that being said, it gives me great pleasure to call upon our first speaker of the day, Dr. Salim Jahan. I'm just going to give you a brief intro because all the bios of the speakers are in your book, and I can be a mean moderator because each speaker has 15 minutes, not 50, but 15, and after which they will politely be cut off. And then, so that we want to have a lot of time for Q&A, and we want to hear from you. And Brooke also is going to be here, so at the end of this panel, please feel free to direct any questions you may have to Brooke too. So Dr. Jahan is the Director of Poverty Reduction Practice with the Bureau of Developmental Policy at the UNDP, and he has held positions in academia. That's why he was so happy to be a part of this panel, because he has been working with youth at many levels. And thank you so much, Dr. Jahan, for being here in spite of your busy schedule. And he just told me that he likes listening to music and he loves reading books, apart from all the UN books he reads, all the UN papers he writes. So over to you. And Dr. Jahan today will be talking about macroeconomic policies for enhancing capabilities and creating opportunities for the youth. Thank you so much. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Let me start with three initial observations. First, it's very good and it feels good to be in this room full of younger people. In the UN, we don't always have that opportunity, to be very frank with you. The second is, in my dictionary, there is no term called old. You are more young or less young. So I may be less young, but I'm still young. And the third is that I have a PowerPoint. I'm not very fond of PowerPoints because sometimes they have lots of power but no point. But sometimes they have points but no power. But my younger colleagues told me that I have to have a PowerPoint because that is cool. So in order to appease them, I think I have this PowerPoint, so bear with me as I go through them. I would be concentrating on three critical questions that are on everybody's mind, dealing with the whole question of education, unemployment, employment, and the younger generations. The first is, what is the youth unemployment situation in the world? I mean, if we want to have a bird's eye view, how does it look like? The second question is youth unemployment linked to educational attainment? Because we all often hear the argument that if you have a better education, the chances of you for being unemployed is less. So is it correct or not? And third, what macroeconomic policies at the national level can one think of for addressing the issues that I have just mentioned? if we concentrate on the first question first, this is basically a kind of a bird's eye view of youth unemployment in the world. As you can see that it is a major problem, particularly the Middle East and North Africa. More than 20%, 25% is the rate at which the youth unemployment is there. It is also a major problem in other regions, as you can see there. But this particular slide masks three things. The first, it masks the trend in youth unemployment. As you can see, in most of the regions, it is an upward trend. So it is becoming a critical issue, a critical development challenge in most of the regions. The second thing that the first slide masks, that we can talk about the average, but if you go to specific countries, the situation is much more grim and much more critical than the average. For example, if you go to a country like Jordan, then you can see that the unemployment rate is more than 45%. And that is also the kind of the situation in some of the Middle Eastern countries. One should also take note that when you can disaggregate the unemployment situation between male and female, the unemployment situation among younger females is a much more grave concern compared to the males in other countries. The third thing that the first slide masks actually is that the unemployment situation is not only a developing country phenomena. We also know from the experiences of countries like Spain, Portugal, and Greece, that a large number and a large percentage of younger people are unemployed over a longer period of time. So if we look at the youth unemployment situation in the world, we can say it is grave. Second, we can say that the average does not reflect some of the pockets of unemployment which are very critical in many countries. And third, we can also say that when you compare between male and female, the unemployment and the lack of jobs among female is a more critical problem than males in many countries. If we now move to the second question, that whether this unemployment situation in some way is linked to the educational attainment or educational level, what is the situation? So if you look at this particular slide, we can see that the unemployment, the participation of the younger people in the labor force varies according to the educational level, and it varies across countries. A large part of people who have finished the secondary education are in the labor force. In a country like Kyrgyzstan, it's 2/3 of the total young labor force. In South Africa, it is 86% there. But you can also see that a lot of people who have finished tertiary education are in the labor force, for example, in the Philippines and in Pakistan. The next slides then talk about the unemployment rate by education level in selected Arab states. And as we can see that, yes, in some countries, if you are better educated, the persistence of unemployment is lower, like in the Syrian Arab Republic, or in Kuwait, for example. But that's not true in a number of countries. In countries like Lebanon, the unemployment rate among the higher educated younger people is quite high. Same with Palestine, and so on and so forth. So therefore, I think it's also important to recognize, yes, there is a linkage between the participation of labor force and the education level. There is a linkage between the unemployment rate and education level, but it is not uniform across countries there, even though people finishing the tertiary education has problems in getting jobs in many economies. So if we take that overall situation there, then what can we think in terms of what can be done to address those issues? Let me start with an overall approach. If we talk about macro policies, not necessarily targeting on younger people, but macroeconomic policies for employment generation, I would start with certain considerations. The first is often when we talk about employment, people often try to put it whether these are economic issues or these are social issues. I think for me, it's a moot question. Employment is an economic issue, at the same time it's a social issue. You need a good job for sustainable livelihood, but employment and job is also a major dimension of human dignity. It is a major dimension of participation. So I think to talk about employment, whether it's economic or social issue, I think that's a moot question for me. Second, people often talk about that there can be growth-led employment. If there is economic growth, there will be job creation. Yes or no? Because in many countries we have seen the economic growth has paced quite high, but there has not been job creation. So therefore, we have been witnessing the phenomena of jobless growth in many economies. The question then is raised whether we can talk about employment-led growth, where the major focus would be job creation, and if you can really create jobs with higher productivity and increasing progressively higher productivity, maybe that would create the kind of the economic growth that you want. The fundamental point here is there is no automatic link between economic growth and job creation. You need to have job-creating economic growth, and only when you have equitable growth, you have job-creating growth, that would really lead to job creation. The third point that is often raised is the wage employment versus self-employment. In many economies, the space for creating jobs either in the public sector or as wage employment is quite limited, and therefore one has to look at the issue of self-employment. Self-employment is also a means through which the creativity of younger people, the dynamics of younger people can really flourish. The fourth is the issue of pro-job sectors versus overall sectors. And I think it is quite important to focus the investment, the initiatives, the policies on those kind of sectors where there are scopes for further job creation. And finally, the issue of the domestic employment versus overseas employment. In many developing economies, there are lots of younger people who are now migrating to other areas or other countries for job seeking. With those considerations, and I'll go through very quickly, if we look at the overall macro policies for employment generation, the growth that we talked about has to be pro-poor or equitable growth. Economic activities should be in areas and sectors where poor people live. Then there has to be equality of assets distribution, access to basic social services. There has to be national employment strategies, because without the national employment strategies, the unemployment in a particular country cannot be addressed. There has to be initiatives for marginalized and vulnerable groups. And finally, there has to be targeted initiatives or interventions like the rural guarantee, employment guarantee schemes in India. When we talk about the youth employment generation, fiscal policies, tax rebate for self-employed work and using certain technologies can be thought of. There can be monetary policies where you have special credit and interest rates for younger people for self-employment. The idea of youth employment bank, which would be geared towards providing credit and support to younger people, is something that we can talk about. The trade policies where you have the backward and forward linkages of what you do to the rest of the economy for creating jobs would be important. The issue of remittance, the younger people send back to their countries, how you invest them can be good. And then finally, affirmative action. But I also want to move for the whole question of the macro policies for youth education and skill. And there, the issue of aligning supply and demand, vocational skill, skill for service sector, language training, reforming the education system are absolutely important, because when there is opportunities, one has to be ready with the kind of the skills. Innovative approaches, I can discuss it later on, maybe when questions and answers. Online platform for freelance, eDesk, that you can see how it can create jobs in terms of SMEs, and 1.5 million jobs have been created. Impact sourcing, where the different companies are outsourcing some of the jobs to the younger people and the impact of it, and mobile phone for job creation that we have talked about. There should be one-stop shop as well. My final point, and this is an anecdote from Egypt. When I visited Egypt after the Arab Spring, particularly at the invitation of the government to talk about youth employment strategies. And we have been visiting Alexandria and meeting about 200 younger people coming from the rural areas. They told me that their parents, their fathers, forefathers, grandfathers have been in agriculture and have been in rural economy. They don't want to remain in the rural sector. They don't want to get back to agriculture. So I asked them that if you want to come to the urban areas and work in the urban areas, you need to have skill. You can't even sign your name. And they took my cell phone and did something to my cell phone, so everything was out of screen. So I could not call, I could not see my email, and I could not surf my web. And then they gave it back to me. And then they asked me, do you have the skill to get it back? And I said, I don't have the skill to get it back, please. Please, whatever you have done to my cell phone, get them back. And they did it in 3 seconds. So they told me, we don't have the skill, the kind of the skill that you have. We can't sign our name. We can't read or write. But you also don't have the skill that we have. So therefore, if you talk about the skill, we have the skill to be in the urban areas, to be in the service sector, to do the kind of the things which would be needed in the 21st century. So my ultimate point is that there is a choice for all of us, more young, less young. And the kind of the choice that we make today would determine the kind of the world that we have tomorrow. Because in the ultimate analysis, human destiny is a choice and not a chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jahan, first of all, for keeping to time, and I didn't have to exercise myself by showing you papers that you were running out of time, but also for your very informative and very practical points which you touched on, especially when you showed that, yes, education, it's not necessarily meaning that somebody signs their name as opposed to actually getting something to work. So thank you so much. With that being said, now we move on to our next panelist, Dr. Brenda Haiplik, who is from Canada, and she's the Senior Education Advisor-Emergencies at Unicef. And when I was talking to our panelist earlier, and I said, would you like to share one fun thing, because we have so many young people here? She said, yes. And I said, we don't want them to fall asleep, because I really want them to listen to what you have to say, and you have such lovely pictures. So she said, you know what? Last year when I was walking home from work, I saw the president. And I go like, our president or your president? She goes like, no, 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 I saw President Barack Obama. And so it just shows, and she said this was so cool because she saw him at quite close quarters twice last fall during the election campaign. But it also shows that you need to walk to work, not drive. So that being said, Brenda, the floor is all yours. And the title of your presentation, as you can see, is Education in Emergencies and Saving Lives. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's lovely to be here and see so many awake, young, enthusiastic faces. It makes me remember what I'm working for every day, for you and for children around the world. So my presentation is looking at something called Education in Emergencies, Saving Lives. So what you've just heard the first panelist say, think about youth, unemployment, skills, but within an emergency context. So after a cyclone, after a war, after an earthquake, and think of the additional challenges young people and children and families face in those situations. So some basic facts. 61 million children of primary school age and 72 million of lower secondary age are out of school. 42% of the world's out-of-school children currently live in conflict-affected contexts. Enrollment rates in secondary schools are nearly 1/3 lower in conflict-affected countries compared with other developing countries. And 175 million children are likely to be affected by climate-related disasters over the next 10 years. I have lots of pictures. This is a picture I took at a school in Kilinoche town, which is in northern Sri Lanka. As you can see, there was a conflict there for many, many years. In Sri Lanka, if you ask children and parents what the most important thing is, they will say education. Not food, not water and sanitation. They'll say education. So this school reopened and was working in less than optimum conditions right after the end of that conflict. And when that school was occupied during the conflict, children were studying in bunkers, in tents, and other places. So education did not stop. I'm talking about education specifically, but if you look at the big picture, you'll see that education is only part of that other sectors, including governance, the social sphere, environmental, economic, and security spheres, are interlinked. So what happens in education also affects what happens in those other sectors. Everything is very, very much connected. What is education emergencies, which you might hear me call EIE? That's the acronym we use at Unicef. Well, the United Nations General Assembly in 2010 passed a resolution on the right to education in emergency situations, which emphasizes the obligation to secure education for all children, regardless of context. So, in today's world, Mali, Syria, Lebanon, Central African Republic, Madagascar is just recovering from a cyclone. All of those varied contexts, every single child and young person has the right to go and learn every single day. Education is life-saving, it is life-sustaining, and it is life-enhancing. And because it is all of these things, UNICEF works in emergencies, in the acute phase, in the transition or early recovery phase, which is very challenging, and of course in the normal development stage that we're most familiar with. Countries can move along that continuum from emergency through transition into development, and then unfortunately back again. UNICEF had a very large program called the Education in Emergencies and Post-Crisis Transition Program, which ran from 2006 to 2011, sponsored by the government of the Netherlands. And within that program, we reached children and youth in over 42 countries affected by emergencies around the world, and learned a lot about how to respond, how to train colleagues in how to respond, and how to make good education sector plans. This is a picture I took in a tented school in Muzaffarabad, which is in Azad, Jammu Kashmir in northern Pakistan. This was after the earthquake in 2005. We had over 4,000 tented schools in the mountains after that response, during that response. It was a big earthquake. Many, many people died, and many of these schools, the only way you could get to them was by hiking up a mountainside or by helicopter. So why? Why EIE? Why not just wait until things become normal again? Well, education can offer a window of opportunity for marginalized children and youth to participate in education. I want to go back to this picture for a minute. In the earthquake response in Pakistan, UNICEF and other partners working in that sector brought back 37,000 children to school. Sorry, not brought back, brought to school. They had never been to school, 37,000 children. So that was a huge opportunity to offer education to young people who, before the emergency, didn't have that opportunity. Education protects. Schools and child-friendly spaces, which we call CFS, protect children both physically and psychologically, offering protection against exploitation and harm, and creating a sense of normality and routine. Very important. Education can save lives. Schools and child-friendly spaces provide knowledge and skills to survive a crisis through the dissemination of life-saving messages and skills, where the water points are, information about HIV/AIDS, very important key information that can help young people. More reasons. Education can sustain whole communities, not just children and youth in classrooms. Learning opportunities create greater stability in communities and nurture hope for the future. Education can provide essential building blocks for future economic stability. We also know that the provision of equitable, quality education is an important condition for countries to recover from crisis. Children, youth, parents, and communities and community members in situations consistently list education as a high priority. Also, resilience. Education programs can mitigate against the impact of humanitarian crisis by building resilience among community members, including children and youth. Another picture, this is from Vaunia town in northern Sri Lanka. This was a host school that accommodated, before the emergency and the IDP return home, 300 children, with additional children, as you can see, camping out in the schoolyard. So what does Unicef do? We have our core commitments for children in emergencies across sectors, including education. We have a very strong focus on equity, so very much trying to target the most marginalized, vulnerable children and youth. We have a child-friendly approach to education, which is very inclusive, gender-responsive, and promotes safe learning environments. We look at preparedness for emergencies, so how do we help communities prepare for disasters? We work in the education cluster to help coordinate a better sectoral response in emergencies. We follow the Interagency Network for Education Emergencies, Minimum Standards, INEE. We're constantly developing our human resources and capacity, because you can imagine knowing how to order supplies for a mountainous tented school is a different skill than sitting at a curriculum meeting with a National Ministry of Education team. Strategic partnerships. We work with universities doing research on peace building, on emergency response, to try to improve what we're doing and learn from it. We also work with Save the Children, with many other international NGOs and national NGOs and civil society and youth organizations at country and regional level. We build schools, we rehab schools if they've been inhabited by vulnerable individuals or militaries, and we also have many, many transitional schools. We've got a new program on education and peace building, linking that sphere that I showed you earlier, many sectors, back to education and to promoting peace. We do a lot of work in advocacy. A big campaign right now is Education Cannot Wait, which is linked to the Secretary General's Education First initiative. And as I mentioned, research and documentation. In terms of key program interventions, we have safe learning spaces, which protect children, especially teenage girls and women. Back to school initiatives for children who've missed out on learning. We have very interesting kits, such as School in the Box, which is literally a school in a box. Teacher training and psychosocial support, which is critical because it's hard to learn if you're traumatized or stressed. This is mine risk education in a community, again, in northern Sri Lanka. I visited this particular school. There are mine signs within 1 meter of the school. So mine risk education is extremely important. Lastly, advocacy. We're working on promoting the fact that education is underfinanced in emergencies. It only gets about 2% of all humanitarian funding versus health, nutrition, water, and sanitation. Attacks on schools are widespread. Right now, more than 30 schools have been affected by widespread attacks. We must protect teachers, students, and schools. Finally, education sector plans often don't include emergency preparation. We're trying very hard to work with many partners around the world to have this changed so that communities are ready. And lastly, this is the goal. This is a little girl I met in northern Sierra Leone, where the conflict has been over for 10 years, but the needs are still great. And the goal, of course, is to have children everywhere going to school. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for sharing that. And I think your presentation was a very nice compliment to Salim's. It was like the yin and the yang and in perfect balance. The other thing is, and you'll know why I use that Chinese phrase as we move on to our final speaker. He's the last but not the least. And I would just like for us to think for a moment about the brave young girl from Pakistan, Malayla, who suffered so much of abuse because the only crime she committed was she wanted to learn and go to school. So I think we should all realize how lucky we are to live in a free society where we we are able to get education, whether it's in the form of repairing a cell phone or, or signing our names. But I think this is, it's a ripple effect, because what we learn is what we teach. So if you take home a message today, maybe you should talk to somebody and say, you know what, this is what we can do. How do we partner with Unicef? Or how do we partner with somebody? Or how do we start something like my students give up their latte every year to raise money for the kids of Darfur. It's a simple thing. So this is what we need to do. It's grassroots advocacy. So that being said, our next speaker is Kevin Cassidy, who is the Communications and External Relations Officer from the ILO, that is the International Labor Organization. And he will be talking to us about transitioning from school to decent work. And the one fun thing about Kevin, when I asked him, I said, you know what is the fun thing you want to share with our youth here? He goes like, you know what, Minnie? I learned to speak Chinese. I learned classical piano. And because he's musical, and Chinese, especially Mandarin, is very musical, he learned to speak Chinese, and that's how he ended up working in the UN. So all of you who hate languages at school, make sure you learn a language, because you might end up working at the UN. You might end up working for Kevin. So that's why I use the term yin and yang. And Kevin, thank you so much. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. For the students out here, just very quickly, every one of you will have over $100,000 in debt when you finish your undergraduate work. 1 in 5 of you will not be able to secure a job. You're likely to be underemployed, meaning you probably won't be using the skills that you learned at school in the job that you have. Many of you will continue to live at home with your parents because you can't afford to pay for your own apartment. You'll lack health insurance. You'll have greater competition for the jobs that you have than we have had as we grew up through that. You'll have a lower standard of living than your parents do, and you're the lucky ones. I don't mean to shock you, but I think there's a reality here, and what we talk about is that jobs are really central to people's well-being. What we say development, if you know the term development happens through jobs. This basically is the sense of the ILO that decent work is the core of our approach. Work is a way to get out of poverty. It's a way in which poor people develop productive assets for themselves. They string together a number of economic activities to create livelihoods. Not everybody works in offices. Job is very diversified today. You need an adequate supply of jobs. It's a foundation for sustained and growing prosperity, for inclusion, for social cohesion. We'll need about 50 million jobs every year for the next 10 years just to keep up with job growth and the jobs that we've lost because of the crisis. The wave of technological innovations that we are seeing is altering the capacity of modern manufacturing and service to generate new jobs. So you have that built into the structure as well. And we also have widening inequalities. If you're looking at the news today, you'll see the disparity between those who are CEOs who are earning packets of money, 10 million, and those who are starting out. I think the average salary in the U.S. is somewhere around $41,000. After taxes, you're not going to have very much to go on those holidays that you thought maybe that work would bring to you. Globally, 75 million young people between the ages of 15 and 24 are out of work. That's 4 more million since the crisis started in 2007. In Europe, youth unemployment is 30%. Here in the United States, it's 16.4%. And more worrying is that 6 million people have just given up looking for work. Now, it's one thing if an older person stops looking for work. They may have savings, they may have a pension. Probably most of you in your jobs today, as you look for jobs, probably won't have pensions. You won't have savings. So when you stop looking for work, what do? I mean, it really constrains you for the activities that you can do. Let's put a human face on this. Long-run unemployment for young people has a scarring effect. We see that young people get upset that they can't find the right job, they don't have the skills, or they're told they don't have the right skills, they're looking for a job, they say, we don't have experience. Well, how can I have experience if I don't get my first job? So you're caught in a catch-22 situation. High youth unemployment is also associated with higher incidences of unhappiness, of mental health, and then it degenerates sometimes into drug use or into crime. There is a correlation between poor labor outcomes for young people and inequalities. So the greater the inequality, we see the higher the unemployment. This is very important today when we talk about austerity measures, these tax cuts and the investments that are coming out of social services. More and more, when people don't have jobs, they need to rely upon the government in order to provide them for health, to provide them with education service, to provide them with reskilling or training. So you're, again, caught between the two, between a rock and a hard place. So what is the ILO doing? The ILO is the UN institution that deals with the world of work. And the workplace is a unique entry point to deal with social issues. And I'm very happy to hear earlier, there's no debate whether it's an economic issue, whether it's a social issue. Work is both. And that's what's quite important to us. The ILO has come up with a call for action, and this is looking at a range of options. Now, there's no one single approach. There's no what we call silver bullet to address this problem. You have to look at a range of issues, a range of responses, and they have to be tailor-made to that particular country, region, locality. The ILO is paying attention to skill development and to youth entrepreneurship, and also looking at rights in the workplace. We don't want to see young people being denied a job, being discriminated against because you're too young, or they'll pay you poorly, or that word called internship, which is a very important part of getting into the labor market, and sometimes internships turn into unpaid labor and can continue for quite a long time. We need to also put into place some mechanisms that help young people catch up with skills. Now, we're seeing this sort of hollowing out of the middle. We're seeing this missing middle, this polarization of the labor market, where the high-end skilled jobs, whether it be in computer sciences or in finances or in engineering, and then people at the very low end of the job scale who are going in and maybe, the low-end jobs, getting your first job working in a fast food restaurant or working in a factory if you can find factory work. But those middle skilled jobs for people who don't have college educations is disappearing. So what are people going to do? Are they just going to sit around and wait for a job to happen, and then, of course, those costs get shifted onto their families, to their parents, to the government itself, or do they have to accept any job out there? There are many employers, not all employers are this way, but they're trying to maximize their shareholder value. So the profits that are coming back are not going back to the workers in terms of wages, they're going back to the shareholder in terms of their dividends. So we have big problems right now that some of the business communities see this investment in individuals, because when you're paid well, you give more to that job and to that workplace. So it's really quite important to ensure that people have their rights at work, that we are stakeholders, that as a worker, you want to contribute the best you can, but if you do not find dignity in the workplace, if you are not compensated fairly for that, it's very difficult to give your all to that. So we start looking at apprenticeships and skilling programs. Now, you're the lucky ones, as I say. You're the ones who will have university degrees. You're the ones who have these experiences. You're sitting here right today in the United Nations. You're experiencing a range of issues and ideas that maybe you didn't think about before. But there are millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people out there who don't have access to this information. They can't pull up their smartphone and then call up a website. They can't check their emails. They don't have those skills. Some do, as I think the wonderful example earlier was to say that skills are sometimes relative to that. So we're very, very cognizant that you're having these shifts, long-term shifts in the labor market, which is very, very difficult. We also, because we're dealing not just with developed countries, we have to look at a range of issues. So some of the governments are putting in place public employment programs. It was mentioned earlier about India with having a rural employment guarantee scheme. And, this guarantees mostly the poor people at least 100 days worth of work. For some of you who may have traveled around and traveled to developing countries, as it's called, I've always been humbled by the generosity of the poor. I've worked in a number of UN institutions, and I remember one time working on landmines, and I was in the northern areas in Iraq, and a young man. I thought he was older, but he was probably 40 years old, and he looked like he was about 70. He was showing me this list of people who had been injured by landmines, and you know, they have problems such as mining of the schools, mining of waterways, mining of just walkways for kids going back and forth to meet with their friends. And at the end of this, you know, we're looking at all the names of these people, 5 years old, 7 years old, 30 years old, who are losing their arms, losing their lives and their limbs. And at the end of this, you know, we're all sitting there thinking, my God, how are we going to be able to help them? And then he turns around and then offers us dinner. And I know that he had I could see just one chicken running around the yard. So he's given all his food over to us. And that family now must struggle to make it by. So how are they going to have employment for themselves? They're fighting, you know, a post-conflict situation. They're fighting poverty. But yet they show that generosity to others. So it's quite empowering working at the UN and seeing this happening. We realize that no single measure is actually going to work. We need to have a targeted package, but with a multiplicity of approaches to address these. Youth employment schemes are effective when they provide access to training and to employment. There are a number of groups out there doing some fantastic work where they are identifying where the market is, because sometimes it's not the high-end market. Sometimes it is being an electrician. For example, there's a wonderful group called Education for Employment in the Middle East, and a big growing area is for women electricians. Now, in this particular region, men are not allowed into the household when men are not in the house. So having a woman who is an electrician come in and to provide the electrical services is a boon for them. It's wonderful. I mean, not only is it speaking to a cultural need, but it's also speaking to a financial need as well, too. So just in closing, we realize that the youth employment crisis prevails today, but it is not inevitable. And it's not unresolvable. And I think we need to decide what kind of investments we need to make, because we need to see this as an investment rather than as a cost. Investing in our young people is an investment in our future. We know that confronting this challenge, it requires not only just the response from the UN, it requires a response from businesses, from unions, from civil society, from NGOs, from groups such as yourselves, making people aware of these range of issues, because they don't sit neatly into one little box. They impact upon society. No one in this room, I think, has not heard of the Arab Spring. I mean, the major manifestation of the Arab Spring are young people realizing that there's no option for themselves. Those young men and young women in those areas can't start families until they move out of their house. They can't move out of their house until they can afford to do so. If there are no jobs, it creates social tearing at the fabric. I think successfully attacking this problem is not only a critical economic, social, and human necessity, but it's also, as I say, a test of what kind of society we would like to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think what you spoke about, especially about the women electricians, I think that's so nice, because you also touched on gender empowerment in addition to employment and also the dignity of labor.